Well, thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me. I want to start by congratulating the organizers for this. I think it's exceptional, the caliber of guests that you had here on stage today. And I think as we think about governance, I always like to make the connection of the governance being good judgment. And good judgment is the bridge between intelligence and context. And I think what you did exceptionally is bringing high caliber intelligence and put it in a context where this conversation can take place. How many of you are excited about a conversation about AI or technology? Great, because this is not it. So we're not actually going to talk about technology, and then you will see that as we go through this conversation, we'll try to make it as applied as possible and separate AI from purely technology. And I'm honored to have my guests here with me because I feel like we all have a very distinct context, intellectual and practical, that we bring to this conversation that I will state before it. But before I introduce them, I want to state a bit or clarify why is it that I don't think it's about technology. This session is not going to be about technology, and it's going to be about judgment. It's going to be about the type of decisions that we make around AI. And AI has significantly evolved from adopting AI, and I think right now all companies have some sort of AI, so the level of familiarity to the topic is sky high, but the real level of readiness when it comes down to AI dependency on system is probably not quite there. And what recommends me to have this conversation and moderate it is, I think, my personal context. So I spent my entire career of over 20 years in technology, being at both sides of the table, as I like to say, from being a practitioner and all the way to understanding the intrinsic ethics of policy when it comes down to AI. And I'm honored, and I'm going to take a seat because now I'm getting into my catalyst role, honored to have two perspectives here. One led by Stefan Baciu, that leads SaaS public sector practice across Central Eastern Europe and brings decades of bridging this experience about intersection of systems, analytics, and decision-making at large. And what I rely on him to help us understand is how do systems think? What boards misunderstand when they think about technology and systems at large? And why governance breaks when it comes down to decisions. And next to us is Professor Nada Kakabase, which is one of the world's leading thinkers on governance ethics, legitimacy, and board effectiveness. And what I'm relying on her experience of decades studying the difference between boards that act in governance and boards that perform governance is that it's going to challenge the legitimacy of what many organizations call now governance. And because this conversation is about accountability and decision making, I thought what better way than to involve all of you in this and make it a real stress test. So I invite you to look underneath your chairs for a scenario. So now we're getting into full boardroom setup. So you have a situation. I encourage you to check it. It's actually tied in, so thank you, organizers, so pull it. You all have an envelope, a sealed envelope. And in the envelope, you have a session. We have a situation. For the benefit of this, you are all working for an for a company that has already an AI system in place. Do you all have it? I think they're trying to. You got it? Good. So your AI-powered recruitment system has been operational for 18 months. It processed over 50,000 applicants monthly. And this morning, your general counsel received a formal letter from the National Data Protection Authority. An external audit has concluded that that system has been systematically downranking candidates from 3 specific area codes associated with majority-minority population. The statistical evidence is definitive. The system was procured from a top-tier vendor, passed compliance reviews, was approved by your HR, and was documented as bias tested. The regulator letter asks you 2 questions as the board. 1, which member of the board can explain why this system was approved? And 2nd, who will answer for 18 months of discriminatory decisions? How many of you feel like this is a likely situation to occur in the next 6 to 8 months before EU Cloud AI Act comes in place? Thank you. How many of you feel like this is a technology problem? And again, I know I mentioned this is not a technology session, but we will talk about technology. Okay. Do you have an answer? If a regulator comes in, do you have an answer to this? I do feel like it's getting a bit intimidating, or you're playing along. And I'll start by inviting the technology representative here to clarify a bit with us, how would you go about this? Is this a technology, is this a technical challenge?
Might be.
Might be, okay.
There is no yes or no answer to this. AI is a sum of risk and reward. AI basically automates our decisions and helps us decide faster and better. But it can also augment to a massive scale the wrongful decisions. We are in a moment that trust is, I would dare to say, the most important currency. So everything we do, every engagement, either personal or professional, is embedded with trust, and if we lose it or win it, it's a difference between being the winners or the losers, or putting a strong effort to gain it back. The companies now are in a rush to adopt AI to grow the efficiency, productivity, so there are massive gains that can be accumulated by the usage of AI. However, I think an important perspective is having in mind the difference between do the right things and do things right. So AI can help us do things right, but sometimes stay in the way of doing the right things. Now, when it comes to technology per se, as I said, it automates decisions, it helps us make sense of the massive amount of data and complex situations. However, without the proper measures in place, it might derail from our ultimate positive goal. So in the situation that was described, yes, this might be a technology problem that was somehow slipped into the technology, but ultimately my strong belief and our strong belief as a technology company is that the decision of humans can be augmented by AI, but not substituted by AI.
Oh, yeah. As in, we talk a lot about trustworthy AI, and I think it's, I always find it fascinating how we invested trust in technology and how we have extended that to vendors and external parties in a manner that was probably more dependent than governed. And the reason I share this case with you is for you to have that in the back of your mind, and then with the use of the moderation that we'll try to address some of the challenges and ideally the blind spots that boards are facing when thinking about this particular situation. So you covered a bit about the trustworthy AI, and I know SAS does a lot of things on addressing what does the system need to be trusted, and how do you decide to invest trust, and if it's by vendor specific, or is it you get to trust technology at large? And you addressed that in a little bit. Now, there's a perception that when you start governing things, innovation slows down. Is that a real concern?
It is certainly a concern that every guardrail that you put across innovation might be a slowdown. However, if you start thinking with the trust in mind from the very beginning, the innovation and the trust go hand in hand. and you end up with something that is by design trustworthy. So there are tons of technologies now that, as I said, can automate decision making, can automate making sense of the complex situation in the real world in an instance, in real time. However, if you don't think of the consequences or don't at least envision potential harmful situations from the beginning, even if you have a very innovative service or product or initiative, the trust factor can destroy it.
And I think this is where I want to bring back the case, because the system was bias-free. The vendor was tested. Procurement passed it. And yet, there was a bias built in that led to that. What is the vendor responsibility when it comes down to addressing this? And where does the responsibility of a vendor end, and then where does the responsibility of the beneficiary of it? How could a system still be biased if it was bias tested?
All the vendors, I'm not talking with the solo one, do establish in every commercial relationship a relationship built on trust and on partnership with any customer. So while we enable the technology, we work in partnership with any customer to make it fit and to have it shaped the best way it responds to the needs. Now, the bias can happen in various areas, in the selection of the model, in the data that are coming into the system, into the rules that are applied. There's no definitive question without investigation where that bias came from. Yeah, maybe in the tests the biases were not present, but when adding an additional subset of data, something happened. Yeah, so when it comes to technology, the good thing is that is traceable and can be audited. So that's the beautiful thing about technology, that you can investigate where a potential fault might be present.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a very technical answer. And I think very often, in my experience, boards are being deprived from that, and then that typically sits with IT, and then they expect the CTO or the executive team that carries that responsibility to have it represented. But I think it becomes a board responsibility when that carries along the fiduciary responsibility attached to it. And we're not talking about a system deployed, we're talking about operationalizing a decision-making instrument that makes decision on behalf of the organization that can have a wider range of risk that span from reputational risk and beyond. I wanted to pass on to Nada, if you allow me, and address a bit the moral authority of how you govern AI systems and the responsibility that sits with that.
Obviously, responsibilities always of the board, because they are the last place where they have to explain. However, moral authority is the board which has assessed the risk of the system they are adopting. Every system will have certain risk, of course. They have also assessed that those risks can be mitigated, that they have skills to mitigate this risk, and if those risks become alive, they have coherent moral story to explain that the risk was mitigated and why did they took this decision. So if you have all this in place and you are able to explain why this decision was taken and what the benefit is and how it became that it has a risk, how did they manage the risk, then it's a moral authority. If you don't have that, then you have delegated authority. You don't have moral authority.
So you evolved, and so you relied on a vendor in this situation to validate that, and you move from operationally efficiency to delegated morality.
You can't, and whenever you delegate something, it's a moral decision, isn't
Yeah.
it? So you can't delegate it because you are responsible for it.
Yeah.
It won't be a vendor.
Yeah.
So you have to, and you may trust the vendor, but you may not trust the technology.
Yeah.
Because first of all, every design, be it like this glass or anything human-made, AI is still human-made, has embedded value in it.
Yeah.
Okay? Do you understand that embedded value in the system? Okay? Then you have on top of it embedded value of the vendor. Do you understand that? Can you live with that? And then there is the data on which the system is trained, which may be, I don't know, trained in Japan, but you're here in Romania. Do you think that the data, which is not biased over there, is not going to behave biasly here? So you have to interrogate that. Board cannot interrogate all this, but they have to ask their C-suite to provide report that they have done the job, so that they can take the decision then.
Awesome. And what questions would you say it's not being asked now in the boardroom when it comes down to this?
Well, I think that a lot of people on the board, as it stands, and it varies, of course, but majority people are very, very uncomfortable with AI at the board level. I don't say that you have to be AI expert when you sit on the board, but you have to have an awareness of the system or AI systems and to ask questions from your C-suite.
So if you go back to the case, which member of the board could potentially react?
Any member of the board. If you're on the board, you have equal right to ask the questions. Obviously, the chair has the biggest responsibility, but any board member should have asked the question. So,
Okay. You have in your research make a clear distinction between accountability and answerability.
yes.
I would like to know how are you coupling these two, or where do you see the gap between being, because board is ultimately accountable for this decision, but how do they go about being able to answer and react to this in line?
Accountability is a structural issue.
Yeah.
You have a board, you have committees, and boards are, and governments are very good at providing a structure. They have committees, subcommittees, sign-offs, minutes of meetings, and many people confuse that is governance. No, that is not governance. That is infrastructure of governance. Governance is interrogation of arguments, analysis, and decision making. But of course you need that infrastructure. Without that you won't be operating. So it is traceability. You can trace the answer because you look at board meetings. That's a trace the answers. That's accountability, and who is accountable for that? That is very easy to find. However, answerability, it's a person who has to answer in front of grieving audience or grieving person or, grieving mother whose daughter committed suicide because of particular issue with AI. Could you stand up and really explain why decision was made? Did you done all the sound checks and balances for the system? And why that was a logical and right decision to take it at place. That's your answerability. Do you have person who can do that?
Thank you. And if I may reflect on this, I think when we talk about governing AI, there are very distinct ways of looking at it. And I find a lot of boards are governing technology. They're able to govern policies. They govern cybersecurity and different practices. What else happens to AI is that there's the risk in the convergence of this. Your ability to truly have a clear oversight over how things happen when they're exposed to technology is right now limited if you're not addressing it as an overarching and you're limiting yourself to how you're managing things traditionally or historically. If you're managing AI as pure technology, and you think about licenses, you think about procuring technology at large. And then maybe that's another thing that came to mind that I would like to kind of bridge to for a question to Stefan. In your experience in working with various types of clients. How many of them do you feel relate to their AI strategy as being, or they relate to their AI strategy, but when in fact is their default vendor strategy? And I don't know if that's something that you would relate. How many of you find yourself that you're relying on your default technology provider to guide you as you're articulating your AI strategy? No? And that's a trust thing or a cost thing? Okay. Well, efficiency is the primary benefit when it comes down to adoption of AI, right?
Definitely, any business we take now, we cannot assume that they are expert in AI. They are. Let's take for example Transavia. Their business is not obviously technology, right? So they need to rely on the capabilities of a technology vendor to guide them somehow in the process in operationalizing this AI initiative. However, there are principles inside any company in terms of ethics, in terms of finance, in terms of operations. There are, of course, regulations like EUA Act, like regulations coming from US in terms of safety of this technology that need to be embedded in every process. So while we are enablers and guiding these companies to a more, let's say, efficient, productive way of working, we need to be able to embed the experience, the culture of a company, the practices, the guardrails, and to guide in this process. So it's kind of a team effort where we come with our experience, very often similar experience in a specific industry. But there's a strong component that the customer is bringing in terms of their internal processes and ultimately culture that needs to be followed.
And that clearly explains what happened in many ways. But is that enough to react to the regulator? Because the regulator's question was not how well you understand the system, ask if you understand the consequences of what happened. And I think from a board perspective, that goes beyond. And the impact of that situation led into access to opportunity, economic participation, and institutional fairness. And then that brings me back to, we didn't know, or was a vendor problem enough for board to react to in face of regulators? Not knowing is...
Ignorance is never justified. In law doesn't accept ignorance for decision making, because you should make yourself aware of this. So most boards shouldn't decide on something or sign off something which they don't understand. They should ask for more explanation until they're comfortable to make decision. They don't understand it. And of course, I think that regulators now are getting much more advanced as well. They're asking the right questions of the board, and they don't take nonsense for an answers. So I think we're going to see regulators be much more stricter with the boards which are not providing the right answers.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of whether they provide the right answers or they have the right answers. And I would go as far as to take it one step further. It's like, are they asking the right questions? And if so, what are those questions that they should ask of their executive or management team, of their extended vendors, of their investor, the entire ecosystem that will be both influencing and impacted by the decisions of a system that operates at this scale?
Board usually don't have to talk to the vendors, but that is a C-suite responsibility. Mm-hmm. They have to ask right questions from C-suite, because they and CEO who brings policies and to the board to making decision or approve. So they really have to interrogate them. That analysis has to be there. Board is responsible for analyzing that before they make decision.
Well, thank you for sharing that. How many of you feel comfortable that if that would happen to you, you would know how to explain that decision of an AI system of this nature? You would. That's good. I think it helps. I do this type of exercises quite a lot with various boards, and very often the procurement of an AI system of this nature tends to feel like a good idea, because it provides efficiencies of scale, and then it allows an organization to go through multiple profiles and support in the decision-making space. But very often, past the procurement stage, they start to think through what problem are they actually solving with that. Is it simply quantity, or is it quality? And I find that if you would stay a bit more longer with addressing the problem before you jump into solution, you would have a lot of those decision-making skills covered. I often find that you should fall in love with a problem before you decide on what solution to marry. And in the space of AI, there are a lot of solutions for which you try to retrofit what could potentially be the problem that would fit in. And from someone that has been most of my life in technology, I can tell you 100% that over-deployment of technology sometimes can lead to more inefficiencies than efficiencies. So technology is typically not the answer, but it's part of the solution. I wanted to stress this, and I find it super valuable to have additional perspectives when thinking about how do we address a technical challenge that is broader than a system itself in face of regulators, clearly anticipating of the release of the EU Cloud AI Act that will ultimately demand clarity around how do you make that decision, and how do you go through the inventory of all the different applications and go into the data sets. But before I go that, I wanted to maybe go back to Stefan and ask him, where exactly did the system go wrong? And where should the board have intervened with it?
Why do you assume that the system went wrong?
The system never goes wrong, but then I thought it was like, if this happened, where did it go wrong? And where should the board have intervened, given that it's not board's responsibility, as Nada clearly pointed, to go so deep into the woods of technology? But then where does technology end, and then where that responsibility begin?
Right.
In your view?
In such systems, there are multiple areas where things can potentially go wrong. The data part, which is the basis, can be a good point to start with, because if you have biased data, or you build your models on biased data, obviously you enter some bias in the process. Then at the level of the model itself, or the models, bias can happen. How you apply a specific model, how you select a specific substract of data to do the trainings. So in the way the logic of the model is built, there's also potential bias.
May I stop you and interrupt you just a little second there? Because I find that very often when we talk about bias, we assume we all have the same understanding of it. But I wanted to somehow clarify that a biased data set might also mean, in this case, that you've never had an employee from those area codes. So the system trained on that will never look at those area codes because they were never there to begin with. So that could also be bias. So it doesn't necessarily mean that someone tuned the system in any way, but an algorithm is trained on historical data, looks at that, uses that looking forward. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear for everyone. We know that bias can happen. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We all have a certain bias on things.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the thing is that also how you apply the model, through various procedures, through, I don't know, specific campaigns, or the way your team answers, to this kind of inquiries, or the results of the model, there also can be bias. Yeah.
course.
So what we typically preach is that the system should have embedded these kind of principles to understand bias and to understand it at all levels, at data level, at model level, and to have checkpoints where you can actually verify and check for bias. Yeah? And this type of technology exists. Obviously, we're doing. We started with statistics, so basically we can say that for the past 50 years we're focused on this AI, advanced analytics, machine learning, data science thing. Now with the evolution towards large language models, which is basically another subset of AI, things evolve. But if you're thinking of a system that has this trustworthiness checks embedded, you can be a little bit safer that it has the proper guardrails and the proper checks in place at every single moment in time. It can alert and it can identify and trigger some actions to check for bias and to eliminate it. Yeah. So the answer is there, the technology is there, but also very important is how it is applied and how it is managed and how it is handled ultimately.
And are there any examples that you would bring here? I have several that come to mind, but I think if you put things very pragmatic, and I find that a lot of conversations tonight tend to be fairly conceptual and principle-based, which is great. I think there's value, there's merit in that. But I think it's only when it's grounded into an example, a particular example, that things feel very real. And I think with the bias and the story, the case that I picked for us today, it's a very concrete one. It can easily happen, and it's better to simulate and anticipate or prepare for it than just be exposed to it. So concretely on this, and I know there are a lot of examples on social ranking or credit scores, and are there any examples that you feel like you could bring to the audience that?
As you said, in any kind of industry, so banks are highly reliant now on credit risk scoring that is more and more automated, and the decision to finance a group or a specific region can be biased. Yeah? Maybe a specific region historically has kind of a bad risk scoring and ranking, and you decide not to invest or to invest at a minimum in that decision, and that spirals down because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah? You don't invest, the region becomes more and more risky, and it's a downward spiral. Then let's say in the government sector, yeah, you have an initiative, for example, to give some incentives to increase the birth rate. Yeah? Everyone is talking about the aging population of Europe, so some governments have the idea to give some incentives to increase the birth rate, but how do you decide which categories to give this incentive to, in which regions, which amounts? Yeah? So all these kind of decisions, yeah, of course they can benefit of the support of AI and data science to optimize them, but ultimately any of these kind of decisions can be biased and can influence or harm certain categories of people.
Yeah, and I think on this one, if you allow me, just from a technology perspective, there's a whole spectrum. So not everything has to be fully automated, and you have to operationalize decision making. It's a whole range that allows you to still exercise influence and control. And then it's a decision on who should be responsible and accountable for the kinds of decisions. And how will the board exercise control over this? What type of mechanisms should they have in place or expect of their executive teams to ensure that the likelihood of this incident is less likely to happen? Nada.
Well, the board, yes, they cannot have mechanism to control the system because that is the operational thing. That's much lower down in the organization. Their ability is to ask right questions of their CEO and as well other C-suite directors. The same things, board is responsible for a culture. Board doesn't necessarily know how it's through whole organization, but they have parameters which they ask their directors, which are executive directors, to answer. What is the turnover of the chain of the employees, satisfaction levels and things like that. So they have parameters they have to report to the board. The same things with the AI systems. They cannot control the system, but they have to ask right questions from the C-suite to report to the board.
And can we work out on what are those questions that they should have answers to? And I think it's a great.
Very simple question would be, did you have any incidents so far? Was it any reported dissatisfaction with the decision? How does it compare with the manual decision making which we had before the implementation of the system? So there are many parameters you can compare.
So benchmarking against historical
Absolutely.
facts.
Yes.
Thank you. So we talk a lot about the behaviors that exercise at boards, and obviously the limitations of board influence versus the executive team and how that spans across. And I think it's not just an appetite that is supported by the over-familiarity of boards and executive teams around the topic of AI, but it's also the importance of ensuring that they have the right level of literacy, vocabulary when addressing and discussing about AI, as such that they would feel comfortable addressing these questions. And as much as I think it is valuable and it's traditional in many ways to benchmark against historical fact, I feel like we live in some unprecedented times when the adoption of technology outspeeds the decisions of governance and the pace of governance as a governance exercise, and maybe in that space. So would be great to see what are those best practice behaviors, if at all, that you've seen of boards that govern than the ones that are performing governance. And I like the definition of performing governance because very often that's a static thing that gets invoked, especially in times like this.
Real governance, I would call it performing governance is really, do you have a real governance on a papers? You have all your papers in line and you can be audited and they're fantastic. Sorry. I said what they call paper governance. It's when you have all procedure and all documents completely fantastic, all board meetings, everything's documented, but actually write the questions whenever asked at the board, and so they just sign off. And so real governance is really that you have a very honest and robust dialogue in the boardroom. That's where you're not interrogating people who present to the board, but you interrogated arguments which they're presenting to the board. That's a two difference. One is personal, one is impersonal. When you interrogate people, they feel very defensive. When you interrogate just arguments, can you explain this? Why is this? Those are very simple questions, but they're deep and express, what is really behind it. That is a really board. That is a really governing board because they interrogate arguments which is presented to them. They ask right questions, but never interrogate the person because then you'll have defensiveness. You won't have a robust discussion. I don't say argument, discussion. Discussion is really what is important with the board.
If I may add up to this angle, I think declaratively it might often be the situation that every board values certain things like human centricity, equity, inclusiveness, transparency. But the way you move from simply declaring these values to actually embedding them in your corporate structure, and how you make sure that they are not simple words but also actionable areas to focus at every step. Yeah? And it might not necessarily have to do with the AI technology. I think this is the key in terms of board governance, yeah, because if people have these values in mind, of course they will challenge every vendor in terms of bias identification, bias removal, without, yeah, I mean the compliance to any regulation, yeah. it's let's say comes by default, but the way these kind of values are pushed down in the organization and they are actionable, as I said, I think that's the...
Of course, there's a reason I said that board owns the culture, and what kind of culture you have in organization is reflection of the board. So if those values implemented or not.
Yeah. And that's a loaded conversation on culture that I think is deserving of more time that we actually have alluded for this, where you have to kind of revisit the impact on your culture, the coexistence of humans and machines. And there's a term that I often use with that, in going away from governing AI to governing intelligence, acknowledging that that right now we are referring to it as artificial intelligence because it's machine generated, but very soon there's not going to be anything that we can attribute intelligence to that is decoupled from a human context and intelligence that is generated, that has a component that is machine generated. So we might soon refer to it as intelligence at large, this will continue to coexist. I wanted to know, before we get into more of the deep dive and we actually try to see how we can react to the regulator's letter, how many of you feel more comfortable now knowing how to approach this? This exercise is meant to trigger, or not trigger, to stimulate stimulate and simulate a real exercise that very often sits dormant in a governance document. From a policy perspective, it might look good. You have all the checks and balances in place, but unless there's an incident like the one I presented to you, it's very rare that you know exactly how comfortable you should be with the system that you have in place. And there are many that you could simulate to determine whether you have the right mechanism of control, or that your management team has the support that it needs, that you have the right level of literacy, and this is your ongoing development when it comes down to understanding of AI and beyond. So anyone wants to give it a try? How would you answer? If you have 72 hours to react to the regulator, who within the board will take this one? And according to Nada, anyone should. And then how do you justify this going on for 18 months?
And remember, answerability is moral issue, accountability is structural issue.
Well, go for it, you sure? I don't know if there's a microphone somewhere.
Neil McGregor from Chamber of Commerce, very pleased to support this. Well done to you. How about this? No? Well, I'll show you. Congratulations to you all and to the organisers for this event. The Chamber is very pleased to support you with this. My reaction is you've got 72 hours to respond to the regulator. In the first 24 hours, I will A, talk to my lawyers. I'll also talk to my crisis communicator with the aim of seizing control of the narrative immediately. Because the risk you also have here, you're about to trash a tier 1 vendor's product if what you've heard is correct. So what I would do is say, consider taking immediate action to take this thing offline, get it verified, make no comment on the quality of what you've bought or the advice you had from the tier 1 vendor, and go public. Say what you're doing. Say how you're solving the problem, and that way you take control of the narrative.
Well, thank you for the answer. And I think it's and I like the distinction that you made. I refer to it as the impact over optics, and it's sometimes easier to manage the optics of this. And you could likely expect that will go public, if there's no reaction in within that window. But you made a very, and I would challenge you on this. To which extent do we have the certainty that this is a vendor issue? So we know that the system has failed or the way that it's been implemented. Because ultimately, we know that procurement approved it was bias tested, and the vendor was cleared. And then we also discussed that the vendor tool is tested in their environment, but it's impacted by the quality of our data, as in the beneficiary data, that it continues to learn from that process. So we could go ahead and decide that it's a vendor challenge, and then challenge all the other deployments, or we should treat it as a governance situation or issue, and see at which point within that process we probably failed to intervene to know whether that bias was created because in our data sets there was no one with that area code. So it was not discrimination by design. The tool was as operated by design. It failed to deliver what was expected because of how it's being governed. So should that be something to reflect on and see if that crisis team would go across the chain or ultimately call it? And that's, again, that only makes the point that it is a conversation to be had, and then there's a broader spectrum of perspectives that should be consulted before formulating that point of view broadly, for grilling the vendor, but maybe a possible vendor would want to react to this
Sure.
case. That would be your
That's
system.
the classic crisis management by the book answer, obviously. Now the challenge is to think. We have a saying in this type of situations: before the bang and after the bang. Yeah, what you described is after the bang. Obviously, the top class crisis management. However, the exercise that we are in now fosters thinking what we can do before the bank, and basically any company operates with a lot of data. Yeah, some of them can be harmful, personal data, sensitive data, I don't know, bank accounts, things like this. And data that can not be, let's say, as harmful, like data coming from sensors, etc. However, from this stage on, what happens with this data can be harmful in both examples, yeah? Because if you have data coming from sensors and you have an automated system that needs to take some actions, yeah, then something might obviously blow up, yeah? But the same happens with the sensitive data, yeah? If those sensitive data are not properly managed, addressed, cleaned, and not properly utilized in certain models, yeah, it can create harmful situations. So the idea is to have a strong classification and strong monitoring systems on what kind of data are used for any AI initiatives. And it comes down to how you classify the data first, how you handle the data, how you make sure they are correct, they are, let's say, impartial, inclusive. Yeah? So this kind of practices are now available with most vendors who can automatically take you through this process and give you more insight on where troublesome situations can appear throughout the process.
Including bias testing.
But also, you have to know from whom you're buying your technology, because there's many AI systems which are absolutely outstanding in China. I just been in China and see them, which cannot be sold in the West. And there is many technologies which cannot be sold in China. And what is happening, all of those vendors, They have their trap or backdoor on every technology from Microsoft to Windows, which they can access your data. Just keep that in mind. So,
So where does the board responsibility sits with this? And I
Yes,
want to make sure
yes.
that we kind of go back to the original question on who in the board can explain that decision and who answers for it. And you gave a very straight answer that anyone in the board, the board itself. Now, I would want to go one step deeper into this one, and then I'll reference you on what's the governance perspective, and then what is the systems perspective. But I want to introduce that level of nuance or clarity that it is, yeah, of course, anyone in the board can react to it, but it should be someone that understands what inputs were in place, that would have challenged the system, that can own the outcome and the consequence.
It shouldn't be only one. Of course, you should have people who probably have more awareness of technology, like people who have more awareness with geopolitics, like people who have more awareness with HR or particularly market. But everybody is responsible. You don't, being director on the board, you have equal responsibility. So it's your responsibility to make your awareness to ask the right questions.
Okay, so from a governance perspective, everyone is responsible,
Absolutely,
accountable, and be
absolutely.
prepared to
Yes,
react.
Yes.
And should their reaction be similar to what has been raised, or what additional perspective should the board invoke before framing someone as the faulty one?
It's not a blame game. They should know, as you said, if they have assessed the risks and know how to mitigate them and know what's the possibility that that's going to happen, they should be prepared. You have to be prepared to how to answer that question. And you have to have a coherent story before, not making the story after the event. You have to know your logical, coherent, moral story to say why that happened, what decisions you have made along the way.
I think that evolves the conversation from awareness to preparedness.
Yes.
Any questions from the audience before I introduce another level of complexity? How many? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that it's, in terms of any order, it's a matter of showing diligence, and in legal perspective, that is enough. You might never know the answer why that happened. It might never be you couldn't blame the vendor, or because you could get a different kind of crisis in terms of penalties or damaging their brand or getting other kind of commercial, really even worse scenarios. So yeah, I mean, and in terms of who might answer, I mean, this I think is very clear, depending on if the company is public or not public. The communication is made unitary by the secretary of the board, or it's not one certain board member that has the responsibility to give the answer to the
Once the board decides.
regulatory organism. So, I mean, we cannot ever be sure of anything. And like Mr. Baciu said, and I really like, I will keep this in mind from today, well, one of many things, is that the wonderful thing about AI and technology is that is auditable and transparent. And now we know, because I challenge you, and please tell me if you think that the regular HR recruitment system of the human people hiring, does it has bias? Do we know the biases they hold? Could you trace them until now? Do you know if there was someone taking their lives for not being recruited ever in this world? How do you know? Who told you so far? But now we know. And this is the game changer, that we have to be prepared. And of course, the best thing and the only thing we can do is show diligence. And that is enough, because I think we cannot do more than that. Nobody knows the truth, or it might be the case that we could not possibly find it, because anyway, each day brings such new complexity that the game is ever evolving. So it will not be the same. So it will be very difficult in a time frame of 3 days or 5 days or 30 days to be able to retrieve data or the context or so on, just to find the guilty persons or something, like you said. So it's, like the professor said, it's not a blame game here. Thank you.
You're quite right that the bias exists with any person doing the hiring. However, that bias is limited to how many people. Maybe you affect 100 people as a hiring officer. With AI system, you may affect millions of people, because you sold the same system to a number of people, so it can do more damage than one individual. That's only the difference.
But you know, each life holds the same
Merit.
weight. So
It's much better than the typical HR recruitment system when the HR comes to the office, finds a folder like this on the desk, throws half on the garbage and says, we don't hire unlucky people anyway.
And I think if I may draw a conclusion from what you said, I think it's the realization that the power of AI systems might unveil things that there could be, could reveal more of the less auditable practices, for lack of a better statement. So I think it's anticipating and preparing for this. And if I may reflect on the case, given that the time horizon in which this happened, it was 18 months, that could be challenged, that there was an opportunity before you roll it out in production, that you check for any possible biases, and before you think about just the opportunity that the system lays ahead, you also think about the possible consequences and impact, negative impact that might have before that is being audited by a regulator and beyond. But it is a good conversation to have, and I commend the organizers for creating the space for it, because it's easy for us to talk, not as easy, but it feels like it's more natural to talk about AI ethics and responsible AI, and very often that is being decoupled from our own ethics and our own responsible use of anything, and then of technology at large. We only have 2 minutes left. So I wanted to invite both of you. First of all, thank you for the contribution and support of this case, and ask for any last reflections that you would add in, that you would invite the audience to reflect on moving forward, both of you. And then it does feel like we had the complication that I introduced, because it never ends with one letter. There could already be more, and it's not just the regulator, it could be the media, the investors, the operators. So it keeps coming. So that's the complexity that I mentioned that we don't need to talk about now. But I'd like to invite you with your reflections, please.
Thank you. In terms of AI innovation, the idea is not to ask if we could do something, also to ask if we should do that thing, yeah? Because very often we might end with some harmful ideas or applicabilities of that idea. And secondly, AI, as I said, is an enabler, is a decision support. The same way it automates good decisions, it can automate bad decisions. Ultimately, having the human judgment in place as a checkpoint is critical, and it's key.
For me, it's as a board, you have to understand the risks and understand which risk you can manage and which risk you can't manage, and then make decisions. So be prepared that the risk complexity is going up with AI, much more than was it before, and it's going to even get more complex. So just understand what is your risk appetite, and how do you have capabilities to manage those risks.
Thank you. And if I may build on that, I think the biggest challenge and blind spots that I see is fragmented responsibility. I think a lot of these risks are managed individually, but it's the fragmentation of it that might lead to such consequences or some situations. And on that note, thank you very much, and I guess it's...
Thank you. Thank you.
Please stay for the picture, yeah?